Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Sjoerd de Jong, also known as Aurensis, and I've been working with Unreal Engine for 15 years, of which 1 year with Unreal Engine 4. In this video I will go over the various things I've done in Unreal Engine 4 for my upcoming survival and exploration game Solus. This video has as goal to give you a broad view on how Unreal Engine 4 can be applied to an entire game. This video continues on the Unreal Engine 4 presentation I gave at the Swedish Game Awards. Some of the topics of this talk will be similar to what was shown in the SGA video, and other things will be new. This video does not have as goal to teach you how to do the things I did, merely to give you a view on the bigger picture of Unreal Engine 4. I will be doing a series of in-depth videos that will talk in detail about how I made Solus over the coming months. Also note that the game and any example content I release uses textures from gametextures.com, for which they gave me permission. Solus uses about 30 to 40 textures from their site, and I would have never been able to make the game this fast and reach the style and atmosphere that I got without those textures. So I'm very grateful that they allowed me to use their content, and please check out their website. And also lastly, the build I'm using in this video is a couple of months older than the one released to the public. I'll be switching to the public version later on in this video, but for much of the video you will be seeing a slightly older version of Unreal Engine 4. And I'm doing that to make sure that you can see how I started out with the project and how it has currently evolved into a more C++ focused approach. So you can see how it starts to morph from Blueprint to C++. Also you can check out the game at solusthegame.com and my own website at aurensis.com. I would like to start off with not Unreal Engine 4 actually, but something I've done in 3D Studio Max. This is actually nothing to do with Unreal Engine 4, but it does have to do with the building of Solus. And I'm quite happy with the results of this, so I would like to show you exactly what I've done. So what I need for Solus is I need a lot of natural landscapes. So I need a lot of rocks basically. The game takes place in a big archipelago, so you have a lot of different islands and you can go from island to island, explore that island, then go back into caverns, go to the next island, resurface, explore the island, etc. So lots of rocks, lots of little islands, lots of caves as well. You can see I have a whole cave system underneath here. A lot of stuff. And we want to do this with a fairly high art standard. I mean, it has to be fairly pretty. And we want to do this with very few people. So what I was looking for was a way of building rocks and caves in a very easy and fast way. I'm a bit of an environment artist, but I'm not really someone who can do ZBrush or anything. My environment art mostly focuses on level art, level editor related things, or technical art or those kind of things. So I'm not very good at actually sculpting things or going through a proper art pipeline. So I was looking for a way of building caves that doesn't require me to actually sculpt things, that doesn't require me to model everything properly, etc. And that it can be done extremely fast. What I ended up with was this. This is 3D Studio Max. These are all my rocks. And I can show you how I actually started out. It's a very simple trick. The thing is that all the rocks in the entire game, I haven't modeled anything. None of these rocks are modeled. If you look at the game itself, none of these rocks you can see in the caverns are modeled. I haven't done anything. I just pressed some buttons. Same outside. None of this is modeled. I just generated. So I'm quite happy with what I figured out there. It's kind of a cheap trick really, but it works. So what I did is I started out with a plane. So here we have a plane. That's kind of simple. I got a texture from gametextures.com, so this is a texture from them. I changed the color a bit. I added some detail. I scaled it up and resharpened it and such. You know, here there's like an overlay and detail map on top. It's kind of hard to see in Max, but these little dots here. Anyhow, I got an existing texture. I got an existing height map as well. So on gametextures.com, all the textures are supplied with height maps. So what I did was I tessellated this, so it's quite high poly, and then I displace it with the height map supplied with a texture. And what I then get is this. So the diffuse texture is projected on top as well, but it actually takes over the shape. So it's almost like inverse baking. Rather than baking a high poly and then getting the low poly of that, I start out with a simple plane and I kind of bake the texture on top, or bake the mesh, or however you want to define it. It's a very simple trick. So then I did this. That kind of fits. Then I run Pro Optimizer, and I make it cut down the poly count, so it's lower poly and more useful. Then you get a couple of problems with vertices overlapping and weird things, so I do a relax on top of it, which softens it out, fixes most problems somewhat. And then I re-UV map it, simple planar map on top. And then you get this. So now I have a low poly, fairly low poly, it's about 2000 triangles, 3D rock. That's quite useful. And then what I did, because now I have this plane here, it looks like that, is I bended it around. So for example, I would bend the corners a bit, or I would say, okay, fine, just bend the whole thing. That's a bit weird, but let's find another direction. It's a bit weird as well. For example, this, I just bend it in different directions. And then let's say it would stand straight up. So now we have a rock wall like that. And then in game, I can just copy this around. And again, and I would be able to form rocks. This is how I build all the caverns in the game. And the way of doing it like this allows me to build caverns and rocks extremely fast. So I haven't really done anything. I just press some buttons and I automatically get this. So you can see all the versions I did here. All of these are derived from a simple plane. So I have a lot of different takes on it. I start out with 3 base ones. This is simply twice the size. This is the standard one. Sorry, that's the standard one. And this is the standard one offsetted. So I just offset the texture for a bit more variation. I bended away the outer edges a bit, so it kind of bulges out. So it's easy to put. It's easier to do this with, because of the edges going in. And then I simply made a lot of different versions. A more bulgy one that's a bit more pushed in, one that curves over like that, curves downwards like that, curves around like this, the inverse of that, a couple of different distorted ones, one like that, etc. A couple of different takes on those as well. So I end up with this big library. This whole process takes me just a couple of hours time. So in a couple of hours time I had all the rocks made already. And then what I do in here is I simply place them all on top of each other. So you can see this is one big one of those, and here, and they all overlap, and it goes extremely fast. So the building of this beach took me 1 day. The building of a cavern would take me a few hours. So in a few hours time I've built an entire cavern. And it looks fairly natural. Of course, it's not always perfect. You do have a couple of stretch parts. I mean, some parts are a little bit stretched. It's not extremely perfect, but for the time it takes to do this, goes really fast. I'm very pleased with the result of that. You can see this is just made up a lot of different things. I even made rock boulders in the same way. These are also generated in the same way, just boulders laying around. Same here, you can see that's a piece like that, that's a piece like that. That. Again, it's not really proper 3D modeling, but it does achieve the result. And also outside I have a material that automatically applies grass on top of it. Therefore, no matter how I rotate to fit the mesh, the grass always stays on top. So it looks as if the top is always grassy. All of that is automatic. In general, a lot of it is automatic. For example, the beach becomes darker where the tide is. You can clearly see this here. I will go into that more later on. But where the water is, the ground gets darker and it gets more wet, it gets more reflective. This is hard to see in the editor. Most of the things I've done only show up in game, so you actually have to play it. It doesn't preview very well. But that happens automatically as well. Same for in the caverns. That's actually a very good thing to start out with, a very simple thing. For example, here I have this little cave room and there is water at the bottom. So there's a bit of water. That water is tied to the ocean tide outside. So when the ocean outside goes up, this goes up as well. But in order to communicate that to the player, because the player has to understand that this is a dangerous area, he might drown here if he spends too much time here. It might get flooded. I had to color the rocks in a different color. Now I could have done that the Unreal Engine 3 way by making a material instance, applying the material instance there, etc. But then I would have to make a new material instance every time I have a different rock room, because not all the rock rooms are at the same height in the world. They might be at different heights. So what I ended up doing was I made a blueprint, and in that blueprint, I can show you here, it's a very simple blueprint, doesn't do anything. It's a simple cube in here. So it's simply a cube mesh. I replace the mesh once it's placed, so once placed in the level in the properties, I can then reassign the mesh to it. You can see here, I reassigned the mesh to this one instead. Simple cube mesh. The event graph is empty, nothing here either. In the construction script, however, we have a very simple on yourself, create a dynamic material instance of the material to use, so you can reassign the material. And then he will set the scalar parameter with this parameter here, which is exposed to in the properties. Therefore, if I lower this, then the rock, I can show you actually by just copying the rock first. I'll move it to a bit of empty space here. Because if it goes down, it automatically becomes watery. So underneath a certain part in the world, it automatically becomes more greenish and affected by the water. This number offsets that. So now I've made a blueprint that simply automatically makes a material instance for it, assigns it, and then sets this number as a material instance parameter. If I would have done this in Unreal Engine 3, I would have had to make a new material instance every time I want to change the number. So in the content browser, I would have had to make a new material instance each and every time. Therefore, I would end up with 20 to 30 to 40, 50 different material instances, which are all kind of the same in the content browser, and that wouldn't be very clean. So what I have now is just a single material which is instanced behind the scenes by the blueprint. You can also see my folder setup here. So what I did is I organized it in a couple of base folders like these, with blueprints obviously being the blueprints, and have an environment that covers almost the entire game. That's all the levels. I got a general, which is stuff that applies for everything, so literally generally useful stuff. A couple of base materials, some icons as well. I have some curves in here. Material functions as well, I'll get back to that later. I have some very basic meshes, just spheres and planes and such. So I have that there. Items has all my items. So for example, if you would have a game with weapons, I would have made a folder with weapons. Levels has the levels. Player has everything to do with the player. So HUD elements, post-processing things, those kind of things. And sounds has all the sounds, UI, all the UI. In each of those folders, I would have a material folder, a mesh folder, well, other sometimes, a texture folder, and probably, as you can see here in FX, an FX folder with particles. That's how I usually did it. And then in each of those folders, I would have all the things that are textures or meshes. So these are all the meshes, all the textures, all the materials, etc. I tend to give a clear name prefix to it as well, but it's up to you how you want to handle that. As you can see, this is how I set it up. Also material wise, I can show you the materials that I've done. I didn't go with the layered approach that Unreal has. I went with a more old school approach of using material instances. So most of my materials are actually material instances, and they are all derived from a couple of big material masters. So most of the masters I have in materials here, general materials. For example, I can give you the outdoor one. This is the outdoor master. So this is used on almost all the rocks and everything that's outdoors. And there I build a big shading network. It's a little bit messy, but this is the whole thing used for my outside materials. So I didn't do layered materials. I simply have the master material and everything else instances away from that master material. So most of these are instances from that one. This one, for example, comes from that one. Also, I make extensive use of material functions, for example here. So I made my own function library. I'm releasing that function library to the community as well, so feel free to use it. But I have my own function library. You can see them over here with things I often use. And I think that's a very good thing to do. So if you're going to start a project, I would advise you to do the same thing. If there are combinations of nodes, material expressions, that you're using a lot, group them together in a function, because if you later on want to change how it works, you only have to change the function and it would automatically update in all the different materials. So here I have a function that applies detail normal mapping. If ever I want to change the way detail normal mapping is done, I would only have to change this one once and it would update in all the materials. So material function is basically a little a group of material expressions grouped together in a single node that you can then easily place around in other materials. So I have a whole setup of those things I use often. You can see here's another one. Here's one, etc. in order to improve the workflow a bit. So on all the materials I do both detail texturing and detail normal mapping. Seems to work out quite well. I'll get back to some of the other things later on after we had to take a look at the blueprint. Also physical material based wise, I don't think my setup is entirely correct actually, but it seems to work, especially because the game is kind of gritty and dirty and dark. So I get away with not doing it perfectly. So what I do is, for the majority of textures, I only have the diffuse and the normal map. So all of the tileable textures, and most of my textures are tileable, so I can get away with this. You can see it's simply done like this, so I save a lot of memory doing that. However, for more advanced things, so for example, say the ship parts, because the ship parts are quite complex and they're quite detailed. For example, especially this thing is very big and detailed. Here I did make a roughness map for it. So for things like these, I do make a roughness map, but when I can skip it, I do prefer to skip it. This is the roughness map used. My red one is my roughness map. Then in green, I have a general mask map that simply splits the very shiny parts from the non-shiny parts, so I can use that to kind of scale the values in the material editor. So this is simply a mask. And then blue is my ambient occlusion, and those three together gives you this. So I don't have a metallic map, I actually invert the roughness map, increase the contrast, do some brightness adjustments, etc. and that becomes my metallic map in the editor. So rather than importing a new metallic map myself, I just generate it from the roughness. Again, this may be not entirely correct, but it does save a lot of memory for me and it kind of works for me. And this is called a merge map, where I combine red, green and blue in one texture, because you're dealing with 3 grayscale texture basically. So you might as well just use the red, green and blue channels for those 3 grayscale textures and group them together in a single one and save some memory. Also can talk back about the environment. I can actually show you how I can move some meshes and show you how the grass shader on top actually works. For example, this mesh, we can move it here. And you can see, first of all, the grass on top is world textured. So if I move the mesh, the grass texture stays in place. Therefore, it looks as if it's moving, but it's actually the mesh moving, the grass stays in place. Also, if I rotate it, you would see the grass would automatically appear on top and no longer on the sides. This way I can freely rotate this rock however I want, and it would always fit whatever I do. I do the same trick with ground meshes. Let's see if I can find it somewhere. I'm not sure if it's used in this level, but I made some very simple ground meshes. So the majority of ground in the caves is done with the terrain landscape, which is fine, but I also made a different system which allows me to very easily make ground, especially because you don't always want to make a giant landscape, because these kind of landscapes are kind of large. And it's kind of justified here because it's a very big cavern, but let's imagine you have this very small little cavern somewhere. You don't want to be making a landscape just to be able to fill up that tiny little cavern. That would not be very performance efficient. So what I did was I made meshes like these. Simple planes. They're very simple. You can see it's just a bunch of planes. You can take, for example, say, I don't know, this one or so. It's a very simple little plane. It's quite low poly actually. But the material that's on it is quite special, and the material that's on it allows me to do the following. So here's the mesh in the world. First of all, it has the same thing. If you move the mesh, the texture stays in place, which means that if I have two of them and they overlap, you do not see a single seam. I also added to the vertex normals, so even with lightning on it, I'm not gonna be able to have it lightning on it here, I think. Oh, let's place a light. Even with lightning on it, you can't see a seam. At some point, due to light mapping and such, there might be a very minor seam. Also, the reflection might cause a very minor seam, but in general, it's pretty seamless. In fact, I can even scale it no matter how much I want, and it doesn't really do anything. So now I scaled it up all the way through, and there still is no seam. Actually, there's a very small seam now, but it's very forgiving. So this way, the intention was that I could do the following, that I can just copy the planes around, rotate them as I wish, scale them as I wish, and hey, we have a bit of sand that goes up and down. In fact, I can also vertex paint them. So I could use the vertex paint tool. I forgot what colors to paint. I think one of the primary colors. So let's just see what that does. And you can see I can paint another texture on top because it saves that information in the vertex colors. And all of this is entirely seamless. So everything I've tried to do with building the environment in the game has really been focused on how can I do it as fast as possible. I'm not just after making pretty pictures, I really wanted production ready. I really wanted focused on speed. I mean, it's one thing to make pretty pictures, but it's another thing to be able to make pretty pictures really fast. And making something pretty in itself won't make a game. The only way I can make a game is like if I can find ways of building these kind of scenes extremely fast in a matter of hours. That's the only way it's going to work out. That also goes for the buildings actually. So what I have here all the way at the end, here we have buildings, ruins. This section is not yet finished, so it's quite early in production, but for example at the very end there's a room somewhere here. Here we have a room. This entire thing has been made up of just different modular meshes. So what I did was I made a giant library of meshes. You can see them here. I have a lot of them. So I made all of this. And for your information, all of this, it's 600 meshes. Took me 2 days to do or something like that. So this is just 2 days of work. And they all use one single texture. So all of these meshes use the same texture. I can show you the texture as well. It's extremely low on memory. I mean, I really only need a normal map, a diffuse map, and the mask map containing the roughness information, etc. That's it. We'll actually have a very low res emissive as well. Those four. That makes up everything. Everything you see here except for the walls. That's my texture. It's a 4K texture. 4K because it's used all over, so that justifies a really large size. And it's basically just a number of bars going across and a number of elements that are useful through. Just universally useful elements basically. Here you can see the max file where I built these things in. So there's a lot of different meshes. As you can see, it's about 600 or something. And for me it's really just mass production. So I started out with actually modeling the thing in high poly. This is the high poly. It's a bit funky colored, but you can see this is the high poly thing. Then I baked that to a plane. So I simply baked this down. So I have a normal map. I ran it through Endo to get a base. I did some manual work on top of it myself as well. And then I began doing low poly meshes using parts of that texture. So I began with the most standard bit, which are just straight bars. And the colors and the textures here are not the final ones. These are just using temp ones as reference. But I just started making this. In fact, I even started simpler than that. What I did was I made low poly versions of the stuff I baked. So next to it here, it's a bit covered up, but for example here, I made simple low poly parts of every strip in the texture. And then what I started doing was I took these two, or for example these three, and then I said, okay fine, let's rotate this. I attached it there, like so. It's not entirely accurate, but same for that one. So I basically composed everything out of the different strips that I made earlier, like that. And then I continued like that, and then eventually I ended up with all of these meshes over here. For example, things like this, which are just the different parts added together. I merged all of them in the same mesh, I light mapped the thing, and then I made different versions of that. So here's a version, the same meshes, just pulled up on one side. Here's the same, but half the length, and pulled up half the length. I think these are the same as the standard ones. I made 2 divisions halfway through and pulled one side up, even shorter ones, corner ones, different variations on that. Stuff where the middle goes up, I think that's the last one, and a couple of other random ones here, a lot of different modular walls. So I just mass produced all of this. It's all using the same texture. And when I start this, I didn't have any idea really how the buildings in the game would look. I simply know, because I mean I've been building levels for a long time, so I know what works and what doesn't work. So I simply built all the pieces that I knew might potentially work. So for me, I'm approaching this like Lego. I'm approaching this as a level designer, not a 3D artist. I'm not building a beautiful scene, I'm building levels. And as a level designer, I expect to be able to have a number of Lego blocks available, modular blocks available. So I basically design my own Lego blocks. It's the same as if you're going to build a Lego building. You don't build a Lego building either by starting to think like, yeah, I need this kind of piece, and then starting to design the pieces you need. You start the other way around. You start looking at your box of Lego and you're like, I have these and these and these different pieces available. What kind of building can I do with the pieces I have available? That's exactly what a level designer does. So for me, I just built a huge set of Lego blocks that I know are probably going to be useful, and then I'll figure it out in the editor how exactly I'm going to compose them. So when I start all of this, I had no idea whatsoever how the buildings would look. I simply built blocks that I knew would definitely work. Then I exported it to Unreal, all 600 of them, and then I was able to start building buildings. Of course, it helps that the building isn't realistic. It's kind of an abstract building, but it does go very fast. So a lot of the things I do are very unorthodox. This goes against everything a 3D artist would want to do or should do or all that, I guess. So I really don't follow the normal rules. Same for the rocks outside, like the ways I've built the caves. You can see them here. These are just different planes thrown together. It's very unorthodox. It's not the proper way of doing things, but it does allow me to make 50 to 100 cave meshes and rock meshes in a single day. To make all of this in 2 days. So you're looking at 2 days of work. 2 days to make the high poly plane, make the texture, and make all the modular pieces. This is 2 days. And that means in 3 days time, I got 600 modular building meshes. I got 100 completely useful rock meshes. And then I was already able to start building. And then making rooms like this takes me 1 day. Making a beach like this with all the meshes placing and the terrain painting and all this. This is 1 day, etc. So I can basically make one of these scenes a day with my current workflow. So it's very unorthodox. It's not really the proper way of building things, but it goes extremely fast for me. And that's what matters the most, I think.